Some houses are not empty. They are only waiting for the one person who can hear what the walls have been keeping alive. At 1:43 in the morning, inside the abandoned Whitmore house on the edge of Briar Falls, Vermont, Mason Hale woke to the sound of claws against old wood. For a moment he stayed still beneath the faded quilt he had pulled from the linen closet, listening as rain tapped the cracked glass roof above the east wing. The mansion breathed around him in long, tired whispers. Floorboards settled. Pipes clicked somewhere behind the walls. Wind slipped through broken window frames and moved down the hall like a visitor who knew the way. Then came the sound again, sharper and closer. Scratch. 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 Mason sat up, his hand closing around the flashlight beside his bedroll. "Ranger," he whispered. The German shepherd did not come. The room beyond the library was dark except for the pale wash of moonlight falling through torn curtains. Mason pushed himself to his feet, broad shoulders stiff beneath his faded flannel jacket, denim shirt wrinkled from travel, boots waiting beside the rug. At 40 years old, he moved with the cautious steadiness of a man trained to notice what others missed. His tired blue eyes swept the doorway, the hall, the broken banister beyond. Short brown hair, touched with gray at the temples, fell slightly over his forehead. Light stubble shadowed his jaw. He looked like a man who had spent years carrying silence without asking anyone to help him set it down. The scratching came from the East Library. Mason followed it down the corridor, flashlight beams sliding over faded wallpaper, covered portraits, and a row of closed doors that seemed to lean inward as he passed. Whitmore House had been left alone for nearly 50 years, or so the town said. Yet nothing about it felt empty. It felt paused. Waiting. The library doors stood open. Inside, shelves climbed to the ceiling, their books swollen from damp air, their brass labels green with age. Rain whispered against the cracked skylight. Near the back wall, beneath a portrait covered in dust, Ranger stood with his front paws braced against dark paneling. He was 6 years old, a strong German shepherd with sable, black, and cream fur, alert amber eyes, and a calm loyal face that rarely showed fear. A dark service harness hugged his chest and shoulders. He was not barking. That troubled Mason more than any noise could have. Ranger only went silent when something mattered. The dog pressed one ear to the wall, then lifted his paw and tapped the lower panel 3 times. Slow. Certain. Deliberate. Mason crossed the room. "What have you got, boy?" Ranger stepped back and looked up at him, eyes bright in the flashlight glow. Mason touched the wall. The wood was colder than the rest of the room. Not just damp. Cold in a way that seemed to come from behind it. He ran his fingers along the panel seams and felt a narrow gap, hidden beneath decades of dust. The house groaned softly overhead, but Ranger did not move. Mason found the edge of a loose board and pulled. It resisted at first, then gave with a tired crack, releasing a breath of air so cold it brushed his face like winter from underground. Behind the panel was darkness. Not a closet. Not a crawlspace. A narrow opening descended beyond the wall, and inside it, carved from old stone, were steps leading down beneath the mansion. Mason held the flashlight toward them. The beam fell across the first stair and caught on something small, dull, and metallic. Ranger lowered his head but did not touch it. Mason crouched, reached into the opening, and picked it up. It was an old dog tag, darkened with age, hanging from a short broken chain. He rubbed the surface with his thumb. The letters appeared slowly under the dust. Daniel Hale. Mason stopped breathing. The name pulled the room away from him. Daniel Hale, his father, a quiet veteran who had rarely spoken about the years after he came home. Daniel Hale, who had once told Mason that some shelters save more than a body, they save the part of a man that still believes he belongs somewhere. Mason had not understood it then. He barely understood it now. He looked from the dog tag to the stone staircase, then to Ranger, who sat beside the hidden opening as calmly as if he had found exactly what he had been brought there to find. Rain moved across the skylight in silver lines. The old books seemed to hold their breath. Far below, somewhere under the mansion, A faint sound drifted upward, soft and trembling, like a single string touched in the dark. Mason closed his fingers around his father's dog tag, and for the first time since arriving at Whitmore House, he understood that this inheritance was not a house. It was a question his father had left beneath the floor, waiting for a loyal dog, a wounded son, and the hour when the past was finally ready to be heard. The dog tag stayed in Mason Hale's palm as the hidden staircase breathed cold air into the East Library. He did not go down right away. Some doors, once opened, ask a man to remember how he arrived before they allow him to understand where they lead. Ranger sat beside the opening with his ears forward, patient and steady, as rain stitched silver lines across the cracked skylight above them. Mason turned the tag over again and again, feeling the raised letters under his thumb. Daniel Hale. His father's name belonged to work boots by the back door, black coffee before sunrise, quiet hands fixing things that other people had given up on. It did not belong under the wall of a forgotten mansion in Vermont. Yet there it was, cold with age and waiting like a small metal prayer. 3 days earlier, Mason had been parked outside a closed feed store in western New Hampshire, his old green pickup backed beneath a maple tree bare from late autumn. Ranger slept on the passenger seat with his muzzle on Mason's jacket, his dark service harness folded beneath him like a second skin. Mason had spent the morning repairing a farmer's collapsed fence line for $75 and a thermos of coffee. It was honest work, the kind that left his shoulders sore and his mind quiet for a few hours. Since leaving the army, quiet had become both what he wanted and what he feared. He was 40 years old, broad-shouldered, white, with tired kind blue eyes, short brown hair graying at the temples, light stubble, and the habit of watching doorways without meaning to. He had a folded toolbox, 2 changes of clothes, an old field jacket, and a German shepherd who seemed to understand every silence he carried. The letter came through a veteran's assistant's office that still had his forwarding contact from a winter he had spent in Maine. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, and formal, with the return address of Bennett and Lowe, attorneys at law, Briar Falls, Vermont. Mason almost left it unopened on the dashboard. He did not know anyone in Briar Falls, at least no one living. But Ranger woke, lifted his head, and placed one paw lightly across Mason's wrist. That was Ranger's way of saying pay attention. Mason opened it beneath the gray afternoon light. Dear Mr. Hale, it began. We regret to inform you that Abigail Whitmore passed away peacefully on October 3rd at the age of 91. Pursuant to her final will and testament, you have been named sole heir to Whitmore House and its remaining grounds located at the north end of Briar Falls. Mason read the paragraph twice and felt nothing at first but confusion. Abigail Whitmore was not family, not exactly. She was a name from childhood, spoken by his father only once or twice, always softly, always followed by a change of subject. Mason remembered visiting an old woman in a white house when he was very young, perhaps 6 or 7. He remembered a porch swing, lemon cookies, and his father standing unusually still in the hallway, staring at a closed door, as if it had once saved him from something he never explained. Beneath the legal notice was a smaller envelope, brittle with age, sealed in blue wax. The handwriting on it was elegant but shaky. For Daniel Hale's son. Mason's throat tightened before he knew why. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written by Abigail herself. Your father came here broken. What he left below belongs to you. Mason sat in the truck for a long time while the sky darkened over the empty road. Ranger watched him without moving. The words did not make sense, yet they had weight. They sounded less like an inheritance, and more like a hand reaching from a room Mason had never been allowed to enter. He drove to Briar Falls the next morning. The road carried them through small towns, covered bridges, red barns, white church steeples, and hills wrapped in fog. Vermont in late autumn looked like a world made of wet stone, brown leaves, and smoke rising from chimneys. By the time Mason reached Briar Falls, rain had begun to fall softly, turning the sidewalks dark and shining. The town sat in a narrow valley, neat and old, with a green at its center and a clock tower that marked the hour with a tired bell. Clara Bennett, Abigail's attorney, met him in an office above the pharmacy. She was in her 60s, composed and careful, with silver hair, rimless glasses, and the calm voice of someone who had learned not to rush sorrow. She handed him a heavy ring of keys, several documents, and a sealed folder. "Mrs. Whitmore was very clear," she said. "The house is yours, but she asked that you spend one night there before making any decision." Mason frowned. "Why?" Clara looked at Ranger, who sat quietly beside the chair, then back at Mason. "She said the house would explain itself if you brought the dog." Mason almost smiled at that because it sounded impossible. But Clara did not smile. Near dusk, he drove north out of town, past stone walls and leafless orchards, until Whitmore House appeared at the end of a long drive lined with black maples. It rose from the mist like a memory too large to bury, with ivy climbing its brick walls, tall windows dark as closed eyes, and a roof line sharp against the low sky. Mason stopped the truck. Ranger stood on the seat before the engine had gone quiet. The dog's amber eyes fixed on the mansion, not with fear, but recognition. Mason looked at the keys in his hand, then at the rain moving over the windshield. He thought of Abigail's note. He thought of his father's silence. And somewhere deep inside the old house, though he could not yet hear it, something was already waiting. Briar Falls did not welcome Mason Hale so much as study him from behind rain-streaked windows. The town was small enough for every stranger to become a question before he reached the second stop sign. Main Street curved around a white-steepled church, a brick post office, a diner with warm yellow light in its windows, and a hardware store with rocking chairs sitting empty beneath the awning. Wet leaves clung to the sidewalks. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin blue lines. Somewhere, a bell rang 3 times, soft and tired, as if the hour itself had grown old in that valley. Mason drove slowly, both hands on the wheel, Ranger upright beside him in the passenger seat. The German Shepherd's sable, black, and cream coat looked almost silver where the rain-dim light touched it. His amber eyes moved from storefront to storefront, alert but calm. Mason had learned to trust that calm. It meant Ranger was gathering the world carefully, scent by scent, sound by sound, before deciding what mattered. When the pickup stopped outside the diner, an older man in a brown work coat stepped out from under the awning and watched them with the stillness of someone who had been expecting the road to deliver a ghost. He was thin, white-haired, and slightly bent at the shoulders, with soil-darkened hands wrapped around the top of a cane. Mason lowered the window. Rain carried in the smell of coffee, damp wool, and wood smoke. "You Mason Hale?" the old man asked. Mason did not answer right away. "Depends who is asking." The man gave a small nod, either offended nor amused. "Henry Cole. I kept the Whitmore Gardens before the house stopped needing gardens." His eyes shifted to Ranger, and something in his weathered face softened. "That dog has the look of one who listens before judging." Ranger blinked once, dignified and quiet. Mason stepped from the truck, pulling his faded flannel jacket tighter over his denim shirt. At 40, with broad shoulders, tired kind blue eyes, short brown hair touched with gray at the temples, and light stubble along his jaw, he carried the worn steadiness of a man used to being measured by strangers and found difficult to place. Henry looked at him for a long moment. "You have your father's eyes," he said. The words landed harder than Mason expected. "You knew him?" Henry looked toward the north road, where mist gathered beyond the last houses. "Everyone who mattered to that house knew Daniel Hale. Few knew enough to speak of him rightly." Before Mason could ask what that meant, the diner door opened and 2 women paused inside the warm light, their conversation fading when they saw him. A man at the counter turned his head. The old town seemed to draw a breath. Henry noticed and gave a tired sigh. "Briar Falls remembers badly. Do not let that trouble you too much. People confuse silence with truth when enough years pass." Mason glanced at Ranger, who had come to stand at his left side, harness dark against his strong chest. "What happened at Whitmore House?" Henry's hand tightened on the cane. "Kindness happened there. That is what some folks never forgave." He would say no more in town. Instead, He pointed Mason toward the northern road, then climbed into the passenger side of Mason's pickup after asking, with old-fashioned courtesy, whether the dog minded company. Ranger allowed it, though he watched Henry with grave attention in the mirror. The road to Whitmore House rose past stone walls, bare orchards, and fields silvered by rain. Henry spoke in fragments, as if each sentence had to pass through a locked gate before leaving him. Abigail Whitmore had lived alone in the mansion for decades after her husband died. She kept one wing heated, one kitchen working, and one lamp burning every night in the East Library. Children in town dared each other to run to the gate and back. Adults called the house abandoned, cursed, unlucky, too expensive to save. But Henry said Abigail never called it abandoned. She called it unfinished. In her last years, Henry murmured, she would sit by the library window and say the house was not empty. She said it was waiting. Mason watched the windshield wipers sweep rain aside in slow arcs. Waiting for what? Henry looked at Ranger. For the right ears, maybe. Whitmore House appeared at the end of the drive like something carved out of leather. Ivy climbed the brick in dark ropes. Tall windows stared from under steep gables. The front steps were slick with moss, and the once white columns had grayed to the color of bone. Yet even neglected, the mansion had dignity. It did not look dead. It looked patient. Mason parked near the circular drive. Ranger was out before Mason could reach for the leash, moving toward the front doors with his head low and his ears forward. Henry did not follow at first. He stood by the truck, hat in hand, looking up at the dark windows. She lived in that house until the end, he said softly. One room, one chair, one bell by her bed. But every night she made me check the library fire, even when no fire had been lit there in years. Mason turned the key in the front lock. The doors opened with a deep wooden sigh. The grand hall beyond smelled of dust, rain, old wax, and time. A chandelier hung above, its crystals clouded but still catching the faint gray light. A staircase curved upward into shadow. Portraits watched from the walls under veils of linen. Mason stepped inside and felt the air shift around him, as though the house had recognized weight on its floor after a long loneliness. Ranger crossed the threshold and stopped. He did not sniff the corners or explore the stairs. He turned his head directly toward the east wing. Toward the library. Henry, standing behind Mason in the doorway, whispered, Well, I will be. Mason looked down at the dog. Ranger's body was motionless, but his eyes were bright, fixed on something Mason could not yet see. From somewhere deep in the house came the faintest sound, almost hidden beneath the rain. Not a creak. Not a pipe. A single soft note, like a string touched in a room below the world. Henry made the sign of a man remembering a prayer he had nearly forgotten. Mason did not move. The mansion held its breath around them, and Ranger took one careful step toward the darkened hall. Mason followed Ranger through the grand hall as the rain softened against the high windows and the old mansion gathered its shadows around them. Henry Cole remained near the doorway, one hand resting on his cane, unwilling to cross farther than the entry, as if the house had drawn an invisible line only Mason and the dog were meant to pass. The east wing smelled different from the rest of Whitmore House. Less of dust and more of cedar, old paper, and cold stone. Their footsteps moved over a long runner rug faded almost colorless by time. Portraits lined the corridor beneath linen covers, their shapes turning the walls into a row of silent witnesses. Ranger walked ahead with deliberate calm, his sable, black, and cream coat catching the dim gray light, his dark service harness snug across his strong working dog frame. He did not sniff at random doors. He did not pause at broken molding or the places where rain had stained the plaster. He knew where he was going. The library doors stood partly open at the end of the hall. Mason pushed one with his fingertips and it swung inward on a low whisper of hinges. The room beyond was wide and tall, with shelves rising nearly 20 feet, a rolling ladder resting crooked on brass rails, and a cracked skylight letting in the soft percussion of rain. The air felt colder there, enough for Mason's breath to show faintly when he stepped inside. A long reading table sat in the center beneath a sheet of dust. 2 armchairs faced a fireplace that had not held flame in years. Above the mantel hung a portrait of Abigail Whitmore as a younger woman, her eyes dark and thoughtful, one hand resting on the shoulder of a man Mason did not know. Ranger moved past the table and stopped near the rear wall, behind a bookcase filled with swollen leather volumes. He sat, lifted one paw, and tapped the floor 3 times. Mason had seen that signal before. Once near a washed-out culvert in Maine. Once under an old barn outside Albany. Once in the mountains where a hidden hollow beneath rock had changed the course of a long afternoon. Ranger did not use it often, and never without reason. Mason crossed to him, and crouched. "You hear it again?" he asked quietly. The dog angled one ear toward the wall. Mason listened. At first, there was only rain, the faint settling of beams, and Henry shifting somewhere far down the hall. Then, beneath it all, came the sound from earlier. A single note. Not music exactly, but something close to it. A thin vibration that seemed to rise through stone, touch the back of the shelves, and vanish before the mind could catch it. Mason laid his palm against the paneling. The wood was cold. Not damp cold. Deep cold. Underground cold. He moved his hand across the wall and found places where the grain changed direction, where the panel seams did not match the boards around them. Someone had hidden a door so carefully that age itself had nearly become part of the disguise. Ranger stood and pressed his nose to the lower edge of the bookcase. Mason brushed dust aside and discovered faint scrape marks in the floor, curved and old, as if the entire case had once been moved. He gripped the side of the shelf and pulled. Nothing. He looked for a latch, feeling along carved trim, brass rail, the underside of the lowest shelf. His fingers found a small depression behind a row of cracked hymnals. When he pressed it, something clicked inside the wall. The bookcase shifted less than an inch. Ranger stepped back, calm but alert. Mason pulled again, slower this time. The shelf swung outward with surprising grace, releasing a breath of air that carried the smell of extinguished candles, dry stone, and paper sleeping in the dark. Behind it was another layer of paneling, narrower, older, and marked by a hand-sized iron ring set low into the wood. Mason turned his flashlight toward the floor. There, half buried beneath dust at the threshold, lay a strip of brass engraved with small letters. He wiped it clean with his thumb. Below is not darkness, but memory kept safe. The words raised the small hairs on his arms. Henry's voice came from the hall, thin with awe. "Mrs. Whitmore said there were rooms no floor plan ever admitted." Mason glanced back. The old gardener stood just outside the library, pale but steady. "Did my father know about this?" Henry lowered his eyes. "Daniel knew more about this house than any man I ever met. But he carried other people's secrets like they were glass. Careful. Quiet. Never showing the cuts." Mason looked again at the hidden panel. The dog tag from his pocket seemed suddenly heavier. He could feel the name Daniel Hale through the fabric of his jeans, a small pressure against his thigh. Ranger touched the iron ring with his nose, then looked at Mason. The message was plain. "Open it." Mason took hold of the ring and pulled. The old panel resisted, then gave with a soft wooden sigh. Cold air spilled into the library, moving around his boots and lifting dust from the floor in silver swirls. Beyond the panel, a narrow space opened in the wall. The flashlight beam fell across rough stone, then down, revealing the first curve of a staircase descending beneath Whitmore House. The steps were worn in the center, not abandoned, not untouched, but used by many feet over many years. Mason knelt at the entrance. On the first step, exactly where Ranger had found it hours later in the long dark of night, a second trace waited, a small brass hook fixed into stone, shaped to hold a chain. The dog tag had not fallen there by accident. It had been placed. A signal. A welcome. A key made of memory. The thin musical note rose again from below, clearer this time, trembling through the stairwell like a voice too old for words. Mason looked at Ranger, whose amber eyes reflected the flashlight in 2 steady flames. All right, Mason whispered. We listen. The house seemed to settle around that promise, and for the first time since he had crossed the threshold, Mason did not feel watched by Whitmore House. He felt invited. Mason stayed at the mouth of the hidden stairwell, while the rain moved softly over the cracked skylight behind him. The East Library had changed in the span of a few minutes. It was still the same room with swollen books, dust-dulled shelves, and cold air resting between the furniture, yet now every object seemed arranged around the opening in the wall, as if the mansion had spent 50 years pointing quietly toward this one place. Ranger stood beside the first stone step, calm and steady, his sable, black, and cream fur touched by the flashlight glow, his amber eyes fixed below. The dog tag lay heavy in Mason's palm. Daniel Hale. Mason closed his fingers around it until the edges pressed into his skin. Why would you leave this here, Dad? He whispered. Henry Cole answered from the library doorway, though his voice sounded as if it came from much farther away. Because your father was a man who believed some messages should only be found by the person meant to carry them. Mason looked back. The old gardener stood with both hands resting on his cane, rainwater shining on the shoulders of his brown coat. His face was pale, but his eyes were clear. You knew about the tag? Mason asked. Henry shook his head. No. But I knew Daniel left something behind. Mrs. Whitmore never said what. She only told me that one day his son might come, and if he did, the house would know him. The words should have sounded impossible. Instead, they settled into the room with the quiet weight of truth. Mason turned the dog tag over. A second line was etched faintly beneath his father's name, nearly hidden by tarnish. He wiped it with the edge of his flannel sleeve until the letters sharpened under the beam. Quiet Hall. Ranger lowered his head as if recognizing the phrase before Mason did. Henry drew in a breath. That is what she called it. Mason faced him fully. Called what? The old man's mouth tightened, not with fear, but with the ache of remembering too much. The room below. The thin musical note rose again from beneath the stairs, softer this time, like air passing through old wire. Mason felt it in his chest more than he heard it. He stepped back from the opening and searched the wall around the hidden panel. There had to be more. Abigail Whitmore did not leave riddles without purpose. The brass strip at the threshold carried its careful inscription. Below is not darkness, but memory kept safe. Along the right side of the stone entrance, half covered by dust, he found another mark, 3 small initials carved into the mortar. D. H. A. W. Daniel Hale. Abigail Whitmore. Mason brushed them clean with his thumb. The initials were joined by a small carved line shaped like a roof. He did not understand it, but the sight of his father's initials beside Abigail's filled him with a strange tenderness. Whatever had happened here had not been random. His father had mattered to this place. Maybe this place had mattered to his father more than he had ever been able to say. Ranger stepped down one stair, then stopped and looked back. Mason followed, lowering one boot onto the first step. The stone was cold but solid. The air rising from below smelled of candle wax, dry wood, iron railings, and paper preserved from damp by some old care. Henry did not come with them. I will wait here, he said. Some rooms are kinder when opened by family. Mason nodded. He descended slowly, one hand on the wall, one hand holding the flashlight. Ranger moved ahead one step at a time, harness brushing the stone, paused soundless except for the faint scrape of nails. The staircase curved beneath the library, then turned sharply, deeper than Mason expected. The walls were not rough like a cellar. They were carefully laid stone, each block fitted with a craftsman's patience. Small brass hooks lined the wall every few feet. Most were empty, but some still held old tags, ribbons, or small wooden plaques. Mason paused beside one. The plaque bore a name and a date. Samuel Price, United States Navy, Winter 1972. Another read Margaret Ellis, Army Nurse Corps, Spring 1968. Another read Robert Keene, United States Marine Corps, Autumn 1975. They were not decorations. They were witnesses. Ranger stopped at a landing where the staircase widened. On the wall, in a simple wooden frame, hung a faded photograph of Whitmore House with all its windows lit, not abandoned, not empty, but alive. Men and women stood on the front steps wearing coats, work shirts, uniforms, aprons, and tired smiles. Near the edge of the photograph, younger than Mason had ever seen him, stood Daniel Hale. His father's hair was dark then, his posture straight but uncertain, his eyes looking away from the camera towards someone just beyond the frame. Mason reached up and touched the glass. The years between them seemed to fold for one quiet second. His father had been here. Not as a visitor. Not as a rumor. As someone held by the house when he needed holding. Below the photograph was a narrow shelf with a sealed envelope resting on it. The paper had yellowed, but Mason's name was written across the front in Abigail Whitmore's elegant hand. He opened it carefully. Daniel asked me never to tell you this unless you came here on your own. He arrived at Whitmore House in a season when he had forgotten how to sleep indoors without listening for sorrow. He repaired our pipes, our furnace, our roof, and then, without knowing it, he helped repair the hearts of others who came after him. What he left below is not shame. It is proof that shelter can turn survival back into life. Mason's vision blurred. Ranger turned on the landing and pressed his shoulder against Mason's leg. For years, Mason had known his father as quiet, distant, dependable, and unreachable in certain rooms of the heart. Now he saw something else. Daniel Hale had once been the man at the door, soaked by weather, unsure he deserved warmth. The musical note trembled again from below, clearer and warmer now. Mason folded the letter, placed it beside the dog tag in his pocket, and continued down. At the bottom of the stairs, a wooden door waited under an arched stone frame. Above it, carved in plain letters worn smooth by time, were the words "The Quiet Hall." Ranger sat before the door and looked up at Mason, not asking permission this time, but giving it. Mason placed his hand on the latch, and the old door opened inward on a room his father had never found the words to describe. The quiet hall opened not with grandeur, but with warmth. Mason had expected stone, darkness, perhaps the raw emptiness of a forgotten cellar, but the room beyond the wooden door held a stillness that felt cared for. His flashlight moved slowly across polished floorboards, iron bed frames made with folded wool blankets, a long table set beneath shaded lamps, shelves of books, a small chapel corner with a simple wooden cross, and rows of framed photographs along the far wall. The air smelled faintly of cedar, beeswax, old paper, and something softer, like lavender stored in linen drawers. Ranger stepped inside first, paused silent, his amber eyes calm beneath the dark straps of his service harness. He did not search the corners or show alarm. He walked to the center of the room and sat, as if he had brought Mason to a place meant for rest. Mason stood just inside the doorway, unable to speak. Beneath an abandoned mansion, hidden behind a library wall, was not a vault of gold or some cold family secret, but a sanctuary. The room was wider than the house above suggested, stretching under the east wing in a long, graceful chamber supported by stone arches. Electric lamps had been wired neatly along the walls, their cords old but carefully maintained. A cast-iron stove stood near one corner, polished clean. Beside it sat stacked firewood, dry and ready. Someone, perhaps Abigail Whitmore herself, had preserved this place with quiet devotion long after the world forgot it existed. Mason crossed to the nearest bed and touched the folded blanket. It was clean. Not new, but clean. On the small table beside it rested a tin cup, a Bible, and a card with a name written in careful ink. Arthur Bell, United States Army, Winter 1969. Mason turned slowly. Every bed had a name card. Every shelf had handwritten labels. Every photograph seemed placed not for display, but remembrance. Ranger moved toward the wall of photographs and stopped beneath one frame. Mason followed. There, among faces of men and women from different decades, was his father. Daniel Hale looked young, perhaps in his late 20s, thinner than Mason remembered, wearing a work shirt with rolled sleeves, standing beside Abigail Whitmore and her husband in front of a newly repaired furnace. His father was not smiling fully, but something in his eyes had softened. Someone had written beneath the photograph, "Daniel Hale restored heat to the east wing and stayed through the winter to help others find their footing." Mason read it twice. The words entered him gently and hurt all the same. His father had never told him this story. He had never said that he had once needed a place like this. He had only taught Mason how to tighten pipes, patch roofs, clean tools, and leave a room better than he found it. Maybe that had been his way of telling it. On the long center table, several leather-bound ledgers were stacked beneath a glass paperweight. Mason opened the first. The pages listed names, dates, meals served, repairs made, letters mailed, jobs found, doctors contacted, dogs sheltered, winter coats distributed. It was not a guest book. It was a record of mercy, written in practical details. Ranger rested his chin briefly on the edge of the table, his breath moving the corner of one page. Mason smiled faintly through the ache. "You found their history, boy." The thin musical sound came again, but now he saw its source. Along the far wall hung a row of small brass bells attached to fine wires disappearing upward through the stone. A note on the wall explained that each bell once connected to a room in the mansion above. When a guest needed help but could not find the words, they could pull a cord, and someone in the quiet hall would come. One bell still trembled lightly from the draft moving through the staircase. The sound was not haunting. It was calling. Mason walked farther into the room and found Abigail's desk near a small arched alcove. Her shawl still hung over the chair. A fountain pen rested beside a closed journal. On the front page, in her elegant hand, she had written, "A shelter is not a place where sorrow ends. It is a place where sorrow is no longer left alone." Mason lowered himself into the chair. The sentence seemed to press both hands against his heart. He thought of nights in his truck when Ranger slept beside him and Mason pretended he was only passing through, not lost. He thought of his father standing in the memory of that white house from childhood, staring at a closed door he had never explained. He thought of all the men and women whose names lined the staircase, each one having come down into this hidden room carrying something too heavy for daylight. On the last pages of Abigail's journal, Mason found the truth of the inheritance. Whitmore House had once operated quietly as a refuge for returning veterans and their working dogs. When money ran low and public opinion shifted, Abigail and her husband kept the sanctuary hidden rather than let it be sold, mocked, or turned into something cold. Daniel Hale had helped repair the structure, update the water system, and prepare legal protections so the house could one day reopen under the care of someone who understood both service and homelessness of the spirit. Abigail had underlined one line near the end. "If Daniel's son ever comes with the dog who listens, give him the house, the trust, and the door." Mason leaned back, the journal open in his lap. Ranger came and sat beside him, solid and patient, his sable, black, and cream fur warm against Mason's knee. Above them, Whitmore House still looked abandoned to anyone passing the iron gate. But beneath its floors, in a room of clean blankets, old bells, careful records, and names preserved with tenderness, Mason Hale finally understood what his father had left below. Not a treasure to spend. Not a burden to escape. A purpose waiting quietly in the dark until someone brave enough to listen opened the door. Mason read Abigail's journal, until the lantern light seemed to gather around the words instead of falling on them. Every page made the quiet hall feel less like a hidden room and more like a living heart beneath Whitmore House. There were entries about winter coats hung by the east door for men who arrived without luggage, soup kept warm on the stove for women who had driven through snow because they did not know where else to stop, and retired working dogs given soft blankets near the fire because Abigail believed loyalty deserved a place to rest. Ranger lay beside the desk with his head on his paws, his amber eyes half closed, but Mason knew he was listening. The dog always listened, even in stillness. Mason turned another page and found his father's name written in a different section, not among the guests, but under the heading Repairs and Promises. Daniel Hale repaired the south water line, reinforced the library stair, restored the bell wires, built the cedar bunks, and drafted the first protection plan for the house and grounds. Mason stopped there. Drafted. The word did not belong to a man who only fixed furnaces and roofs. He read on, slower now. Abigail wrote that Daniel had feared the quiet hall would vanish after she and her husband were gone. Developers had already begun asking about the land. Town officials wanted the mansion cleared, sold, or turned into something profitable. Daniel, who knew what it meant to survive because one door opened at the right time, refused to let the house become another story people told sadly after it was too late. He contacted a veterans legal clinic in Montpelier, gathered property records, and helped Abigail establish the Whitmore Veterans Shelter Trust. The trust would preserve the mansion, the wooded acreage, and a private account funded by the remaining Whitmore estate, but it needed a future steward with military service, no conflict of interest, and a direct connection to the original shelter mission. Abigail had written the next line with unusual pressure, the ink darker than the rest. Daniel said, "If my son ever loses his way, let this house remind him what shelter can do for a man." Mason leaned back in the chair. For a moment, the room blurred softly, not from tears alone, but from the strange feeling of being seen across years by someone he had never fully understood. His father had been quiet not because he had nothing to say, but because some truths had become too tender to touch without breaking open. Ranger rose and pressed his shoulder against Mason's knee. Mason rested one hand on the dog's strong neck. "He knew," Mason whispered. "Somehow, he knew I would need this." A small brass key lay tucked into the back of the journal, tied with a blue ribbon faded nearly gray. Beneath it was a note from Abigail. "The final papers are in the cedar cabinet behind the bell wall. Clara Bennett has the public copies. Henry knows enough to guide you to the door, but not enough to carry the burden for you." Mason stood, taking the key with him. The bell wall waited at the far end of the quiet hall, its small brass bells arranged in a line, each connected to a wire that disappeared upward into the old house. Behind them stood a cedar cabinet built into the stone, so carefully fitted that Mason had mistaken it for paneling. The key turned with a soft click. Inside were 3 shelves of documents, all sealed in clear sleeves: the original trust papers, maps of the Whitmore grounds, bank statements, letters from veterans who had stayed there, and a folder marked Daniel Hale, personal. Mason opened the folder with a care that felt almost like entering a church. Inside was a letter in his father's handwriting. "Son, if this reaches you, then you have found the room that found me first. I came to Whitmore House when I had forgotten how to be still. Abigail and George did not ask me to explain my silence. They gave me work, coffee, a dry bed, and mornings that started without shame. I repaired pipes because pipes made sense. I repaired stairs because steps should hold under a tired man. I repaired bells because sometimes a person can ask for help only by pulling a cord in the dark." Mason pressed the page flat with both hands. His father continued, "I did not tell you this because I wanted to be your father before I was my history. Maybe that was wrong. Maybe silence leaves sons to invent their own answers. If so, forgive me. But know this. A house saved me once. If life ever leaves you standing outside your own heart, open this door for someone else. That is how a man comes home." The room became very quiet. Even the trembling bell had stilled. Mason folded the letter slowly and held it against his chest. All his life, he had believed his father's distance was a wall. Now he understood it had been a scar, carefully covered, never meant to shut him out. Ranger nudged the lower shelf with his nose. Mason looked down and found a final envelope from Abigail, addressed to Clara Bennett and the lawful steward of Whitmore House. Inside were certified papers showing that the trust had grown through careful investments, land leases, and timber preservation agreements. There was enough money to restore the mansion, reopen the quiet hall legally, hire staff, support veterans in transition, and care for retired working dogs. Not extravagance. Not wealth for wealth's sake. Provision. A miracle arranged in ledgers, patience, and love. When Mason climbed back to the library, Henry was waiting near the hidden doorway, his hat in both hands. Clara Bennett stood beside him, having arrived quietly after Henry called from the hall phone. Her face showed that she already knew what he carried. Mason placed the documents on the reading table. No one spoke at first. Rain moved over the skylight. Ranger sat at Mason's side, calm as a guardian. Clara touched the trust papers with gloved fingers and nodded. Abigail said you would know what to do when you read your father's words. Mason looked around the library, at the books, the dust, the secret door, the house that had waited longer than any person should have to wait. I do not know everything, he said. His voice was low, but steady. But I know it should not stay hidden anymore. Henry bowed his head, and for the first time since Mason met him, the old gardener smiled. It was small, worn, and full of relief. Above them, the mansion creaked softly in the rain, not like a place haunted by sorrow, but like a place preparing, at last, to open its doors. By late afternoon, the rain over Briar Falls had softened into mist, and Whitmore House stood above the valley with its windows dark but no longer empty. Mason carried the trust papers, his father's letter, Abigail's journal, and the old dog tag into the dining room, where Clara Bennett spread everything across a long table beneath a chandelier clouded by decades of dust. Henry Cole stood near the fireplace with his cane in both hands, watching the documents as if they were living things finally brought into daylight. Ranger lay beside Mason's chair, his sable, black, and cream coat warm against the faded rug, his amber eyes open and calm. Clara worked quietly, reading each page, checking signatures, comparing dates, and placing small yellow markers where the law would need to follow the path Abigail and Daniel had left behind. Mason watched her hands move over the papers and felt the shape of the inheritance change before him. It was not a mansion. It was not land. It was not even the trust, though Clara confirmed the numbers in a careful voice that made Henry sit down slowly. Through investments, protected timber agreements, preserved acreage, and Abigail's untouched estate, the trust held enough to repair Whitmore House, reopen the quiet hall, provide beds, meals, counseling, job placement, medical referrals, and long-term care for retired working dogs. It was not a fortune meant to decorate a life. It was a foundation meant to rebuild many lives. Mason looked toward the east wing, where the library door stood open at the end of the hall. Somewhere below it, the hidden bells waited in their quiet line. Why did she leave all this to me? He asked. Clara removed her glasses and folded them on the table. Because your father asked her to protect the house until someone came who would understand what it costs to need shelter, and what it means to offer it without judgment. Mason looked down at Ranger. The dog's tail moved once against the rug. Henry cleared his throat. Your father did not save this place with money, he said. He saved it by staying when work needed doing and leaving when his staying might have drawn attention. He was quiet, but not absent. There is a difference. Mason held those words in silence. For years he had thought quiet meant distance. Now he was learning that quiet could also mean devotion too deep for display. Clara opened the sealed folder from her office and placed a certified document in front of him. Abigail named you lawful steward of the Whitmore Veterans Shelter Trust. You can refuse, of course. You can sell the house under strict conditions, transfer stewardship, or allow the trust to remain inactive while the courts appoint oversight. Her voice softened. But I do not think she believed you would refuse. Mason stood and walked to the tall dining room windows. The glass was wavy with age. Beyond it, the grounds rolled into wet grass, stone walls, bare trees, and a carriage house with half its roof missing. The work ahead was enormous. Roofs, wiring, plumbing, heating, permits, inspections, staff, insurance, legal reviews, town meetings, and the harder labor of asking a community to remember a kindness it had allowed to become a rumor. He felt the old instinct rise in him, the one that said leave before a place can need too much from you. Then Ranger came to stand beside him and leaned his shoulder against Mason's leg. No force. No demand. Just the steady weight of loyalty. Mason reached into his pocket and drew out Daniel Hale's dog tag. The metal was warmer now from his hand. He thought of his father writing that a house had saved him once. He thought of Abigail waiting in one heated room year after year, keeping one lamp near the library as if faith could be maintained by habit. He thought of the names on the stairwell wall, each one proof that someone had arrived tired and left less alone. Mason turned back to Clara. "I will do it," he said. The room did not erupt into celebration. Nothing grand happened. But Henry closed his eyes, and Clara's breath left her as if she had been holding it for years. Ranger sat, proud and still. That evening, they walked together into town. Clara carried the first set of filings. Henry carried Abigail's journal wrapped in cloth. Mason carried the trust papers in a leather case, and Ranger walked at his side through the fog-damp streets of Briar Falls. People looked up from diner windows, from the hardware store doorway, from beneath umbrellas. Some stared with curiosity. Some with embarrassment. Some with the uneasy recognition that an old story was about to be corrected. At the town office, the clerk remembered Abigail and spoke her name softly. Clara filed the notices to activate the trust, preserve the property, and begin the restoration process. Mason signed where she pointed, each signature feeling less like ownership and more like a promise made in ink. When they stepped back outside, the rain had stopped. The clouds opened just enough for a pale seam of evening light to touch the clock tower and the wet street. Henry removed his hat and looked toward the north hill where Whitmore House stood hidden by mist. "She always said the house would shine again," he murmured. Mason did not answer right away. Across the street, a man in a worn jacket stood under the diner awning with a duffel bag at his feet, watching Ranger with the hesitant eyes of someone who wanted to trust warmth but had been cold too long. Mason recognized that look because he had worn it himself in places where no one knew his name. Ranger looked up at him, then back at the man. Mason understood. The trust paperwork had only begun. The repairs had not started. The permits were not approved. But the door in his heart had already opened. He crossed the street with Ranger beside him and gave the man a quiet nod. "Coffee is warm inside," Mason said. "You do not have to stand out here alone." The man swallowed, glanced toward the dog, then picked up his bag. Behind them, Briar Falls glowed under the first clear light of evening, and far above town, Whitmore House waited in the mist, no longer a relic of sorrow, but a promise beginning to remember its own name. 1 year later, the first snow of December fell over Briar Falls in slow, patient flakes, softening the roofs, the stone walls, and the long drive that led to Whitmore House. The mansion no longer looked like a place the town avoided naming. Its brick had been cleaned, its windows repaired, its roof restored, and every evening warm light filled the rooms that had once watched the valley in darkness. The ivy had been trimmed but not removed, because Mason said some old things deserved to stay if they had learned to hold gently. A wooden sign stood near the front steps, simple and hand-carved, with the words Whitmore House Shelter and Quiet Hall beneath them. Mason had argued against making it too polished. Clara Bennett had agreed. People who arrive tired do not need grandeur. They need a door that opens without asking them to prove their pain. The work had taken months of permits, repairs, inspections, meetings, and careful spending from the trust Abigail Whitmore and Daniel Hale had protected through time. The East Library had been restored first. Its shelves were cleaned, the cracked skylight replaced, and the hidden bookcase repaired so it could open safely. Mason insisted the staircase remain exactly where Ranger found it, with one small brass plaque on the first step holding Daniel Hale's dog tag behind glass. Not as a relic, but as a reminder. The quiet hall below had been brought back to life with clean beds, soft blankets, lamps, reading chairs, a coffee station, a small counseling room, and a corner set aside for retired working dogs, with thick mats and bowls engraved only with first names. The old bell wires were preserved, too. They no longer served as emergency signals, but once each evening, when the house grew quiet after supper, one bell was rung by hand. Its note traveled through the stone like a blessing, reminding everyone that asking for help was not weakness. It was a sound a house could answer. Mason changed slowly with the house. At 40, he was still broad-shouldered, white, with tired kind blue eyes, short brown hair graying at the temples, light stubble, and the same faded flannel jacket over a denim shirt on most days. But the weariness in him had loosened. It had not vanished. True healing rarely erases. It makes room around what once felt impossible to carry. Ranger had grown a little grayer around the muzzle, though his sable, black, and cream coat still shone in firelight, and his amber eyes remained clear and watchful. He greeted every new arrival with the grave courtesy of a dog who understood thresholds. Some guests bent to pet him right away. Some only looked at him from a distance. Ranger accepted both. He had never believed comfort should be forced. On the night the first snow fell, Mason stood in the restored library while a small fire burned behind the grate and rain-warped books, now dried and repaired, lined the walls around him. Clara sat at the long reading table reviewing outreach forms. Henry Cole, older and slower but still wearing his brown work coat, arranged winter greens in a clay vase near Abigail's portrait. From below came the low murmur of voices, the scrape of a chair, the soft thump of a dog settling onto a mat. Mason held his father's letter in his hands. He had read it so often the folds had softened. If life ever leaves you standing outside your own heart, open this door for someone else. That is how a man comes home. He slipped the letter back into his pocket just as Ranger lifted his head toward the front hall. A second later, the doorbell rang. Mason and Ranger went together. On the porch stood a man in his late 50s wearing a weathered coat, holding a duffel bag in one hand and the leash of an old golden retriever in the other. Snow dusted both their shoulders. The dog's muzzle was white with age, and the man's eyes carried the cautious hope of someone who had been disappointed carefully and often. "They told me maybe this place could help," he said. His voice was quiet, almost apologetic. Mason opened the door wider. Warm light spilled across the porch boards and touched the snow at the man's boots. Ranger stepped forward, sniffed the old retriever gently, then sat back as if approving the arrival. Mason felt something move through the house behind him, not supernatural, not dramatic, but deeply alive: the library fire, the hidden stairs, the restored bells, Abigail's portrait, Daniel's tag, every name carved along the stairwell, every bed waiting below. "You are safe here," Mason said. The man looked at him for a long second, then nodded once and stepped inside. Later that night, after everyone had eaten, after the new guest and his dog had been shown to a warm room, Mason walked down the hidden staircase with Ranger at his side. The stone steps were softly lit now, each name along the wall clean but unchanged. At the bottom, the quiet hall glowed with lamplight. Blankets were folded. Coffee steamed in a pot. A retired service dog slept with one paw over its nose. Mason stood beneath the archway and listened to the kind of silence he had once feared, not empty silence, but resting silence. Ranger leaned against his leg. Mason placed a hand on the dog's head, then looked toward the photograph of Daniel Hale standing beside Abigail Whitmore in the winter of long ago. "You were right, Dad," he whispered. "Shelter can bring a man back." Above them, the evening bell gave one clear note through the old wires. It rose through the walls, past the library, past the repaired roof, into the snowy Vermont night. And Whitmore House, once called abandoned by people who never knew how faithfully it had waited, shone over Briar Falls like a lamp left on for every soul still trying to find the road home.